On the evening of April 10, 2026, 4 human beings fell through the atmosphere at nearly 25,000 miles per hour, surrounded by a blinding sheath of plasma hot enough to melt steel. They were sealed inside a capsule called Integrity, relying on a heat shield that NASA already knew was broken. During re-entry, air molecules pile up against the spacecraft and compress into ionized gas. This electrically charged plasma acts like a wall of static, drowning out all radio signals. In Houston, flight controllers who spent years training for this moment sit in silence, listening to speakers that play nothing and staring at screens showing zero data for 6 agonizing minutes. This expected blackout becomes a blind waiting game, where their survival is unverified until the signal returns. To understand why those 4 people were put in that position, we have to look back 3.5 years to the recovery of the uncrewed Artemis I capsule. When engineers inspected the heat shield, they found that the avcoat material had not charred evenly. Instead, it had cracked and fractured, leaving chunks of the shield missing in over 100 different locations. An investigation lasting nearly 2 years found the root cause. The Artemis formulation of the material was not porous enough to breathe during the intense heat of re-entry. This material science failure involves a process called pyrolysis. As the shield heats up, it undergoes a form of combustion that generates gas inside the material. On a properly permeable shield, these gases seep out harmlessly, but on Artemis I, the outer layer sealed itself too tightly. Pressure built until those pockets detonated outward, popping chunks of the shield off like blisters. While the capsule technically protected the vehicle, the physical damage proved the margin of error was far too narrow to risk human lives under the same flight conditions. By the time the failure was understood, the Artemis II heat shield was already built and bolted to the spacecraft. Replacing it meant a half-decade schedule delay for a program already years behind. The decision to fly anyway was haunted by the memory of the 2003 Space Shuttle Columbia disaster. Columbia was lost because of flawed institutional logic, the assumption that because a damaged system worked on previous flights, it would work again. 23 years later, NASA was asking a crew to trust a shield that had visibly failed its only previous test. Charles Camarda, a heat shield expert and former astronaut, publicly disagreed with the decision. He estimated the probability of a catastrophic failure at 1 in 20, far below NASA's own safety threshold. Despite the internal pushback, NASA leadership decided to move forward. They concluded that if they couldn't fix the hardware, they would fix the flight itself. They gambled that a modified approach to orbital mechanics could save the flawed heat shield. Since engineers couldn't afford to replace the shield, they redesigned the spacecraft's trajectory through the atmosphere. The original skip re-entry profile involved bouncing off the upper atmosphere. This gave the shield time to cool and seal shut, trapping those explosive gases inside. Artemis II would instead take a steeper path. By keeping the shield under continuous, high temperature throughout the descent, the outer layer would stay permeable, allowing the internal gases to vent normally. On the evening of April 10th, that radio blackout is underway. The crew is riding the specific trajectory designed to keep that shield from exploding. Inside the capsule, the crew feels nearly 4 times their body weight pressing them into their seats. Breathing becomes a conscious effort as the entire vehicle vibrates while superheated air batters it from every direction. The abstract debates over trajectory and gas pressure have now collapsed into a binary physical reality. Either the math holds or the capsule burns. The specific human beings inside carried the weight of the risk, none more so than Mission Commander Reid Wiseman. Wiseman is a single father to 2 daughters who had already lost their mother. Before launch, he posted a photo with them, knowing they could lose their remaining parent too. Just 4 days earlier, while orbiting the moon, the crew had honored Wiseman's late wife by naming a lunar crater Carol, a bright spot they could see from 252,000 miles away. Now, in Houston, the agonizing 6-minute clock finally runs out. A voice finally crackles through the static. Wiseman sounds calm, confirming the shield held and the parachutes have deployed. The continuous heating kept the material permeable, and the math proved correct. Artemis II proved that a redesigned trajectory could overcome a flawed shield, but its legacy is the reminder of the extreme, unforgiving risks required to push the boundaries of human exploration. At exactly 7:53 p.m. on April 10, 2026, the Artemis II capsule hits the atmosphere at nearly 25,000 miles per hour. The air molecules in front of the spacecraft compress so violently that they superheat into plasma, glowing at 5,000 degrees Fahrenheit, roughly half the temperature of the surface of the Sun. The superheated plasma is highly electrically charged, forming a thick sheath around the capsule that acts exactly like a wall of static. It instantly drowns out all radio signals, severing every connection between the crew and mission control. Inside that vibrating, burning capsule are 4 human beings: Commander Reid Wiseman, Victor Glover, Christina Koch, and Jeremy Hansen. They are enduring forces up to nearly 4 times their body weight, watching through the windows as the world turns to fire. But there is a terrifying reality making this specific blackout far worse than a standard re-entry. NASA strapped these 4 people into this spacecraft knowing that its primary heat shield was defective. It had been tested exactly once on a previous uncrewed flight, and it came back with entire chunks blown off. There is no abort button during re-entry. There is no backup shield. Mission Control is forced to sit in silence, knowing that the crew's survival over these next 6 minutes relies entirely on a highly controversial, last-minute gamble with the laws of physics. To understand the danger, we have to look back 3.5 years to the uncrewed Artemis I test flight. The capsule completed its trip around the moon and splashed down beautifully. But when engineers flipped it over, they found damage in over 100 locations. The heat shield material, called afcoat, had cracked, fractured, and blown away in large fragments. The problem came down to a process called pyrolysis. During re-entry, the intense heat causes the shield material to essentially combust without oxygen. This naturally generates expanding pockets of gas deep inside the structure of the shield. On a properly designed shield, the charred outer crust is porous. It breathes. Those internal gases safely seep outward through the crust and vent harmlessly into the hypersonic slipstream. But Artemis I used a skip re-entry, literally skipping the capsule off the upper atmosphere like a stone across a pond. During that brief bounce, the outer layer cooled off and sealed its pores shut. The hot gases inside were trapped. Pressure built, cracks formed, and when the capsule plunged back into the atmosphere, those pressurized pockets detonated outward, popping massive chunks of the shield off like bursting blisters. This discovery created a massive logistical nightmare. By the time engineers understood the flaw, the Artemis II heat shield was already manufactured and bolted onto the crew spacecraft. Ripping it off and designing a new one would delay the entire lunar program by half a decade. So NASA decided to fly the broken hardware anyway. Instead of swapping the physical shield, the engineers changed the geometry of the return trip. They threw out the skip re-entry profile. They decided to bring Artemis II in on a steep, direct path, coming in fast and scorching hot. The math suggested that maintaining continuous, extreme heat throughout the descent would prevent the shield from ever cooling down. This continuous roasting forces the outer layer to stay porous, allowing the deadly gases to vent normally from space to splashdown. Not everyone agreed with this logic. Former astronaut and heat shield expert Charles Camarda publicly criticized the plan, estimating a 1 in 20 probability of catastrophic failure. To put that in perspective, NASA's own official safety threshold for crew loss is roughly 1 in 500. The institutional logic in the room echoed the tragedy of the 2003 Space Shuttle Columbia disaster. Because the underlying structure of Artemis I had technically survived its flawed re-entry, management reasoned the system would likely survive again. Critics argued that the decision was driven heavily by schedule pressure rather than absolute engineering certainty. That brings us right back to the quiet room in Houston. Flight controllers stare at empty telemetry screens, listening to pure static. For 6 grueling minutes, they have to wait and see if their mathematical workaround held together, or if their schedule-driven gamble just cost 4 colleagues their lives. Then, just before 8 p.m. Eastern, a voice crackles through the static. "Houston, integrity, we have you loud and clear." It is Commander Wiseman, sounding completely calm, confirming the capsule has survived the inferno. The continuous heat trajectory worked exactly as simulated. By keeping the shield under maximum thermal stress, the material remained permeable. The internal gases vented outward, and the outer layers eroded slowly and predictably. shedding the heat away from the cabin without fracturing. Shortly after, 3 massive main parachutes, each the size of a football field, deploy perfectly. They haul the 25,000-mile-per-hour capsule down to a gentle 17 miles per hour, ending in a flawless bullseye splashdown in the Pacific Ocean off the coast of San Diego. Underneath all the engineering debates and thermal models, 4 human lives hung in the balance. Reid Wiseman had lost his wife to cancer 6 years earlier. He raised his 2 daughters alone. He strapped into a burning machine with a flawed heat shield, trusting the math so those girls wouldn't lose their remaining parent. The crew of Artemis II navigated extreme risk by understanding the exact mechanisms of failure. While they were 250,000 miles away, they looked out at the far side of the moon and officially named a newly discovered crater Carroll. It remains a bright spot on the lunar surface, a quiet reminder of what it actually takes to push the boundaries of human exploration and still find a way home.